When I was a kid, way back in the day, I got my first real job as a delivery boy for the local newspaper. I'd also just moved to the town I lived in a few months prior, so I saw it as a great opportunity to get a feel for the area and properly learn my way around. I'd be up first thing in the morning and finish up right before I had to go to school. One morning, I remember it was the month of October. I was making my way down my route. I had to go down some pretty long stretches of empty and isolated roads in order to make it to everybody's houses. And I remember being absolutely mesmerized by seeing all of the leaves flutter down from the trees nearby. That's kind of how I remember it being October. I was only a few hundred feet away from stopping by the house of an older man who lived all by himself. I can remember his name. For the story, and to keep him anonymous, we'll call him Lee. He stopped to talk to me sometimes, and I always enjoyed his anecdotes. However, I knew I wouldn't have the time for that today, as it was Friday morning, and I really needed to get off to class. Regardless, I was in a pretty good mood, and other than taking notes of the leaves, I was blissfully unaware of my surroundings. As I came closer, I heard the sound of Lee yelling, and my good mood was quickly replaced with worry. I picked up my pace to check if he was okay, and just as I rolled up in front of his yard, I heard the burst of a shotgun. I didn't expect it at all, and in fact, lost my balance, causing me to fall off my bike. I got up and saw Lee leaning out of his second-story window, telling me to get out of there. At first, I thought he'd gone insane and turned into a psychopath. But in the nearby trees, I saw that a massive animal. It's just I couldn't recognize it. At first, I thought it was a black bear, but then it appeared to more closely resemble a wolf. It then dawned upon me that it was some strange mixture of both. I couldn't really decide on which creature it looked more like. Regardless, it was massive and absolutely terrifying in every sense of the word. It turned its attention to me, letting out a roar like that of a grizzly, and it began to run towards me. I was already up and back on my bike by now, and I screamed, taking off as fast as I could, flinching as Lee let off another gunshot. I heard the animal make another roar behind me, but I couldn't tell whether or not it was hit. I could still feel and hear the heavy weight of its paws stamping on the ground. But after a few moments, they ceased, and although I'd gotten pretty far away by now, I decided to take a look back, only to find this animal limping back into the forestry, a trail of blood gushing out of it and following its path. I took a moment to catch my breath and try and figure out what exactly was going on, and wanted to go back to ask Lee what had happened. I was scared to cross paths with that animal or thing again. So, I continued on as if nothing had happened, that I had seen nothing. When it finally came time to deliver papers to Lee again, I made my way through the area very carefully, my eyes looking everywhere they could see. When I got to his house, he didn't come out to see or talk to me, which was weird and out of character. This continued to happen up until wintertime, when the snowfall made it so my job was over with. When I went back to working in the spring, he was still absent. I never ended up getting answers, and I've never told anybody about what I knew that I saw that happened. Sometimes I questioned my sanity for a while after that, and sometimes, even up to this day, I still do. But it's important that my story get out there. Hi, what lurks beneath. I'm an 82-year-old man writing into you from France. I'm originally American and have been living here in France for many, many years. I believe I may have encountered something terrible, but it may be of interest to you and your team. I was out in a garden, praying a rosary, admiring the flowers and the bustling of nature, when, all of a sudden, something caught my eye at the bottom. I had cataracts last year, so my eyesight is not the best, but this shape, whatever it was a deep black, dark, matted, and ugly. I walked closer, still praying my rosary. The flowers were all untouched, and showing the vibrant colors of spring. It was beautiful in the garden at the time, the perfect place to pray and meditate. I still walked towards this dark shape, my mouth now slightly open in confusion. This was only around 4 years ago. I actually suffered a fall shortly after this incident that affected my handwriting. So, this is why I'm typing this. I'm only managing to recount this experience now. On top of that, it scared the nerves right out of me, so I've been very reluctant to relive it, let alone tell somebody. From my old eyes, the creature resembled that of a bear. It was quite extraordinary, but as I looked closer and squinted, it had the head, or what appeared to be that of a canine or a wolf. It was very grotesque. Its dark was matted and torn up, it appeared, very almost black-colored, and seemed to have streaks of blood around its face. What was even more horrendous is this thing was feasting on a cat, a little ginger kitten, what it looked to be. I had seen this cat around a few times, but it made me feel sick to my stomach. I immediately started praying, because I knew what I was seeing was demonic. To see such a monstrosity and savagery made me feel so uneasy. Thankfully, this demonic creature didn't seem to notice me, and I walked backwards as quietly as I could, praying for protection. I'm a very religious man, and I believe in evil. There is no doubt in my mind that this creature was absolutely diabolical and demonic in every sense of the word. This wasn't just an unknown animal or an unnatural creature that happened to make its way in the garden. This was placed here, put here, probably through a portal of some kind. It just looked wrong. Animals look like animals. They look like wild creatures. This looked like it came from hell, which would explain its hybrid-like appearance and its humanoid appearance from standing up on 2 legs. Such a collision of 2 animals is a perversion from God. Emerging in even more terrifying form was more than enough to make me want to jump right into an oncoming train. I hope this account is thorough enough, and you can assemble the appropriate details to create an image for you. Perhaps others have seen it in southern France. But anyways, I hope to hear back from you. Thank you. When I was a kid, my dad and I spent a few weeks in the summer building a treehouse together. Well, it was mostly him just doing the work, and me watching. But I appreciated it, and had fun nonetheless. It was finished by July, and from then on, I would spend entire days up there, to the point where it annoyed my mother. For the most part, though, I was left to my own devices, and had a great time. I didn't exactly have friends, so I spent many hours reading books, and it was easy for me to get lost in whatever story I was into at any given moment. I heard some walking around the ground nearby me, and not paying much attention, figured it was my mother asking me to come in for dinner. Before she could ask, I yelled down that I'd be done in just a few moments. That's when I heard some sort of odd grunt, and a chill had gone up my spine as I realized that sound didn't belong to a person at all. In fact, I moved slowly, peeking out of my window, and saw what looked like a large bear circling my treehouse, sniffing the ground. My heart began to race, and I tried to think of what to do. It shot its head up to look at me, and I fell backwards, gasping into my treehouse. It was only then that did it fully register in my brain that there was something wrong with this bear. Its head was that of a wolf's, or looked like it. Given its size and shape and stature, I swore that it was a bear upon first seeing it. But perhaps I'd just gotten it wrong. This wolf or bear, whatever it was growling by now and pacing around even faster. And to my horror, was doing this all on 2 legs, just like a man would, walking upright. I screamed as I felt my treehouse shake. It seemed to somehow have a grip on the trunk, and I held on to whatever I could, so I wouldn't fall out. The shaking had ceased, and I heard it let out more grunts and growls as it went underneath my treehouse and jumped up, using its claws to scratch the bottom of the panels I was sitting on. I kept screaming, but this seemed to only motivate it all the more as it roared and growled, desperately trying to get me out. The growls and roars it made sounded like a combination between a demonic wolf and a screech. I can't really describe it. It's like if you took the grunt and howl of a wolf and dramatically lowered it in pitch. It was terrifying. I was always told that if I left wildlife alone, they would leave me be too. But I hadn't done anything to provoke this. I didn't know what it was, what it wanted, or why it was after me. To this day, I still don't know any of those things. At some point, it broke one of the ladder steps as I heard the wood crack beneath me. Nobody heard my screams, and I had no choice but to wait until this thing gave up. It felt like an hour, but it was probably only 10 or so minutes at best. It stopped, and I heard it finally walk away. Still, I didn't dare look back out the treehouse until I heard my mother calling for me. I found myself having trouble replying. That's when I heard my mother scream and ask what the hell had happened. I peeked out to look at her, and she asked if I was okay and to get down. At first, I refused, but finally came out after a few moments. During my descent down the ladder, my blood went cold as I realized the tree trunk was absolutely bombarded with deep scratches, to the point where it looked like some abstract carving. My mom checked to make sure I wasn't injured and didn't find much past some superficial cuts. I guess everything hit me then, because I burst into tears. She quickly ushered me inside and called for my father. I remember them having some sort of spat, and then being told not to go out into the treehouse for the rest of the summer, to which I had no problem with. As it turned out, a few weeks later, a fire ended up taking our home and the forest which had my treehouse. Maybe it's weird of me, but occasionally, I wonder if that thing that I saw is still alive. After I told my mother about what had happened, her and my father called the police, and an officer did show up to check things out. Even though they thought it was strange, there really was no conclusive evidence as to what animal could have done it, especially when I gave them the description. I think they just chalked it up to some animal. As far as I know, nothing ever became of it. My car had decided to quit on a narrow road that wound down the side of a mountain. I was stranded at a rather convenient spot that overlooked the landscape at the foot of the mountain, and I decided that this would make me easy to find. My cell reception gave me just enough of a window to make a call for roadside assistance. They made it sound like I was going to be waiting a while, just because of how remote my location was. I didn't care, just as long as I eventually got help. You can imagine my surprise when I saw a shadow coming up on my vehicle from behind. I was going to remark to the serviceman about how quickly they had shown up, but something collided with my vehicle from behind and nudged me forward. I swam from the whiplash, and it took me a second to register exactly what was happening. Did the tow truck really just collide with my car? As if to answer my question, I was rammed from behind again. Before I could call the towing company and let them know that the driver they sent was an absolute lunatic, My rear window was shattered, and all I could see was 5 massive claws curving into my car through the broken glass, originating from a giant mass of fur. It withdrew and reappeared at the driver's side door, busting out the window and visibly buckling the door. That's when it hit me. There wasn't a vehicle behind me, obviously. This was an animal, some sort of wild beast. In my absolute sheer panic, I dared to try to get a look at whatever it was by peering through the rear window. The sheer size of animal prevented me from getting a complete picture, but I'm almost certain that the head was as broad as my car, and the eyes, small in comparison to the head they sat in, were burning with a murderous rage that I wasn't used to ever seeing, at least not in an animal. That was the most clear that something non-human ever spelled out to me that I'm dead meat. Now, I want to stress to you that I might seem calm typing this out, but in the moment, was sheer terror, panic, and I thought my heart was going to stop. This was not a calm event, at least not as calm as I was describing. I was in total survival mode, and I guess my poor storytelling doesn't really convey that very well, so please, bear with me. I felt the rear of my car lift and drop. I hesitated at the notion of taking off my seatbelt, but I was caught in a very bad space. It looked like I had a choice between abandoning my car and being seized and torn asunder, or staying in my car as it was being torn apart like a large play toy. The creature's violence toward my car was only increasing, and it seemed like it was only a matter of time before it was pushed, or thrown off the road, down the side of this mountain. I chose to die the brave way, and I swiftly exited the car and began running for my life. I dared to look behind me at my attacker, and that's when I got to see it completely. This wasn't a bear, or what I thought was originally some sort of wolf. It was the largest animal I've ever seen in my life. It didn't have the features you'd expect from a bear. Its snout was much longer. The fur was much more coarse and darker in color, almost like black, with patches of gray. The ears were very long and pointed. It kind of looked like somebody took the head of a werewolf and stuck it on the body of a grizzly bear, and then gave the fur a black color. The bared gums were terribly long, making those heart-stopping teeth look even longer and more terrifying. However, luck was graciously on my side that day. This thing was too busy tearing one of the rear tires off my car with its jaws to pay me any mind. I could still hear the groaning of the rods and the popping of the lug nuts that kept the tires in the car, and those lug nuts were tightened mechanically, which means this thing possessed strength that was incredibly frightening. The emergency vehicle that was meant to take my car away found me running down the road, and I had to tell them there was some animal big enough to push vehicles off the road up ahead. The road was far too narrow for him to do a U-turn, so he drove backwards until he had room to properly turn around. He didn't believe me, of course, but that day remains the most remarkable and the most frightening day of my existence. In fact, even looking back on it makes me tremble with awe and dread. Somehow, because it's only been so long, I'm actually able to cohesively and coherently write this down into a story that actually makes sense. But that's my experience. In the winter of 1996, when I was around only 7 years old, I used to look after my brother all alone. We didn't really have the greatest of moms. I am currently living in Glasgow and have lived in the city the majority of my life. Growing up with a single mom, she would often work late in the evening, and it was my job to come back and look after my little brother for around an hour before she would return. On one particular occasion, I have a vivid memory. I was doing my homework and making some food for my brother and I. We have a little garden out back that is pretty run down, and at the time was overflowing with weeds and foliage. My mother used to throw her cigarettes out there, so it was no place for a child. But I used to sit on the back step and open the door, and this little dog that belonged to our neighbors would poke its head through the hole in the fencing, and I would make little funny faces at it. Looking back, it was a very peaceful and contented time in my life. However, on one occasion, I had a dreadful experience. I heard a knocking towards the back door. My mother had told us to never answer the door. She said it would likely be a monster, but in hindsight, obviously, she was probably worried about social services, because nobody in their right mind or responsible would leave a 7-year-old to attend a toddler. But then I heard a gasping sound, like somebody was suffocating. So, I covered my ears and went to run into our playroom. But no, I decided to be brave. Like my grandmother used to always tell me, that I was a brave little hen and I had to stand up for myself. I walked towards the door very carefully and opened it. The gasping sound was now replaced by a grunting, like groveling, from an animal. I was absolutely petrified, but my legs stood still and firm on the ground. There, before me, was a large bear. But this wasn't like a bear I had seen from nature programs or even picture books. This bear was twice the size of a normal bear. I'm talking humongous, and it had the head of what looked to be a wolf, and seemed to be extremely vicious and terrifying. I thought I was going to be in one of those kid chapter books. You know, the story where you get eaten by one of these things. This thing made me sick to my stomach. It stood there on 2 legs, looking around, salivating and grunting. It appeared to be looking for something or somebody. It continued to look over at the neighbor's dog and grimaced, as if it was getting ready to kill or plotting. I continued to stare, dumbstruck, in my 7-year-old brain, taking in the immensity of the beast as it just sat there in our back garden. A killer with clear killer instincts, and this was only seconds away from me, yet I stood completely frozen. Then, this bear or wolf, or whatever it was, turned around and spotted me through the window. To say it was a wolf or bear is incorrect. Again, I don't even know what it was. It was like some sort of hybrid or something. From my memory, it appeared to be some sort of morphed fusion of both. Like 2 images put together, creating some sort of monstrous, unnatural animal. I do believe I must have had a guardian angel looking over me, because my legs were able to shoot me away from the window faster than the speed of light. I made sure the door was locked, grabbed my younger brother, and hid under my mother's bed until she got home later. When she did, she laughed and checked outside. There was no sign of anything. She told me I was probably just hungry, although I've never heard of anybody saying things because they were too hungry. Years later, she told me that I must have invented this story for attention, but counselors and psychologists have also told me that I may have created this story as a way to garnish affection from my almost nearly absent mother. But to be frank, I know that's all BS. I saw something spooky, terrible, and unnatural, and years later, that same creature still stalks me in my nightmares. I dread to even think about it. If it can evaporate, or if it lives in an isolated region, then how? Where did it come from? One thing for sure, it didn't look natural. It looked evil. There was no friendliness to this being. Anyway, I'm writing this to you to warn anybody who's ever seen such a thing. I was born and raised in the Northwest, also known to many as the Pacific Northwest, and moved around pretty often during my childhood due to my father's job. One of my favorite parts about getting a new home would be exploring the geography nearby and seeing what trails, paths, and waterways it had to offer. When I was just about to turn 13, my family settled down in our 5th house. I took the first morning to explore the surrounding area. Usually, my parents didn't let me wander off into new places on my own, but they figured that I was now old enough to be able to handle it all myself. The entire area was pretty hilly and dense with trees. I saw something moving throughout them, and I tried to get a better look at what I was seeing. All I could spot was dark fur. It moved around again, and I followed it to a small creek. It looked at me, and I tried to put my finger on what animal it was. I didn't have much time to look though, because this thing roared, flashing large, white, dagger-like teeth that I did not want to find my neck between. I began to run, and I heard it heave as it began to chase after me. I screamed, only taking paths downhill, as I knew there was absolutely no way I'd be able to outrun this dog, bear thing, whatever it was. I got the idea to navigate through some narrow areas in between the trees, so I'd have to find a way around. It seemed to work, as I heard its breathing and snarls getting farther and farther away. I made it out of the woods and onto a road at the bottom of a hill, where I had to figure out my own way back. As a young girl, I wasn't exactly inclined to try and hitch a ride from any strangers. I was well into the afternoon by the time I finally returned home, and my parents asked me where I was. So, I calmly explained what I saw, which prompted my younger brother to try and run off to get a look at this thing. My parents told me to be more careful and to not approach wild animals and so forth. Still, it was more than enough for me to never go back into those woods again. My parents, for whatever reason, nonchalantly blow it off as it being some misidentification or some wild animal we've never seen before. And who knows, they might just be right. I am writing in with an odd experience that I had back in October of 2018. I don't know if you have heard, but there is a trend in the health and wellness industry to eat only animal products. It's called the carnivore diet. I have been having tremendous success on the diet, and have even eliminated some major and minor health problems in my life. Well, during October of 2018, I was invited to a carnivore convention in Minnesota. There were hundreds of people at this convention, and many speakers. I thought it was going to be a great weekend. Unfortunately, I was so greatly mistaken, as I encountered a beast that has plagued my nightmares for the last consecutive 2 years. Call it supernatural, I call it otherworldly. So as you can imagine, at a carnivore convention, all of the meals they had were animal-based. This one night, we had ribeye steak, scrambled eggs with coffee. It was delicious, and as I looked around the room filled with like-minded people, I was glad to feel my health had benefited. One of my buddies, I'll call him Brian, had mentioned to me across the table that he had heard that there was some awesome boar right outside the ranch in the woods. He told me he had a gun in his car, and we should go out and hunt for some. I thought it sounded like an awesome idea, no matter how risky. We had lights and thought it would be a fun activity for after dinner when our food had settled. Around 10 p.m., Brian came knocking at my room and asked me if I was ready. We set out with his gun and our torches, or flashlights. We didn't bother telling any of the other guys at the bar, as we wanted it to be a surprise for the next day at dinner. It was a pretty dense forest. I don't remember the name of it, but it wasn't too far out of town. I've never been one to scare easily, so I had zero hesitations walking right into the trees. Brian was walking behind me. We knew there would be a boar around somewhere, and were just careful to illuminate all around us, in case we encountered anything else like a deer. I remarked to Brian just how bright the moon and sky looked, as if it was directly over us. You know, sometimes when the moon and sky is just perfect, and it's so incredibly bright out at night, it's almost like daytime. Well, that's kind of how it was, giving us more light to see than we could have liked. My boots were crunching against the earth, and I kicked the leaves regularly, in case there was any kill we could take back. Brian had called out to me. He was about 10 feet ahead of me, and looking sideways with his light. He noticed there was something in the distance. I looked over, and I could see there was something large and black, but it had its back turned to us. He told me that he thinks it was a huge boar, and we both laughed. Brian, suppressing his giggles of excitement. At that moment, this beast turned around to us, and in fact it was not a boar, nor was it a bear. It was something that was very hard to describe because it stood up on 2 legs, just like a person, and reached well over 7 feet tall, which initially was crouched in a squat-like position. Its face was now fully illuminated in our flashlights, and I could see it was fox-like or wolf-like. It had all the usual features of a wolf, except that it had the grimace that looked menacing, and that it was not happy to be disturbed in its place. The creature's body, however, was much bulkier than a wolf. A large mass of fat and form covered its brown fur, just like that of a bear. What on earth was this? To me, it resembled some sort of hybrid creature, like a descendant to our wolf or bear. A bearwolf, I guess you would say. Brian exclaimed. Then the creature exposed its long, wet, red tongue, licking its fur, exposing large fangs coated in deep blood. It was clearly eating a kill, and we had disturbed it. We dropped our flashlights and ran as fast as we could, just like little girls running from bugs. We just followed the light, since we weren't too far away. Whether it was from the convention or the moon, I didn't know, but we were running for a solid 7 or 8 minutes before we finally got back onto the grass outside the hotel. There were some people outside having a few drinks, wondering what we were up to. We both looked at each other and realized just how disheveled and like amateurs we looked. I couldn't speak, as my mouth was so dry, but we just went back to my hotel room in shame, wetted my face and cleaned up. I ended up drinking the rest of the night until I passed out. The next morning, I went to look out for Brian, but he had actually checked out of the hotel and left the convention entirely. I didn't actually have his number, and that was 2 years ago, and I still can't get this experience out of my head. I just hate the confusion, not knowing exactly what it was. I don't feel like this was a monster, but definitely a creature that I've never seen before. Something that isn't supposed to roam the forest. Maybe him and I were both hallucinating. Anyway, I hope this experience gets some attention from other investigators, and maybe, just maybe, I will hear about more people who've had an encounter with the same animal. I was with my family for an extended vacation at Yellowstone. We were at a cliffside overlook where they had installed, those coin-operated binoculars. They let you spy on the world down below. I'm sure if you've ever been out, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. I popped in a couple of coins, and behind sweeping the landscape, not really looking for anything in particular, just taking in the vastness of the whole thing. My view meandered down to a river that wound its way through the trees. My depth perception was momentarily thrown off by the presence of a huge black shape that seemed to lumber alongside the water. This shape was walking on 2 legs, just like that of a person, bipedally. That's what threw me off at first, and in fact, I actually mistook it to be a very, very large man, until I got a better look at it, where my mouth dropped open. The scale of this thing, or what I would call a beast, because that's really the only way to describe it. It made several average trees look like shrubs as it walked by them. Could this have been a Bigfoot? But the shape, the look of this thing was wrong. It had the gait of a bear, but no bear. Not even grizzlies would be this big. The fact that such an animal was this size and didn't collapse under its own weight implied peerless strength to me. The shape of its head alone, and the way its shoulders were raised above all else, made it kind of look like a wolf. I have never, in all my years ever, heard of bears breeding with wolves, or creating any sort of crossbreed or hybrid of the two. That had to have been one unfortunate wolf, let me tell you what. But I couldn't deny what I was seeing with my own eyes, that this did indeed look like some sort of mutant hybrid, whether it happened by an act of nature or in a laboratory. That I don't know, and to be honest, I don't care, because it still shook me so bad. Now, I just mentioned to you the Bigfoot thing. I've never seen a Bigfoot, nor have I ever believed in such a silly thing. But now that I've seen this, I'm starting to speculate otherwise. I don't know what Bigfoot are supposed to look like, but from everything I've ever heard in pop culture, I'm pretty sure this isn't it. I felt a shiver run through me as I saw something else. Several canoes came down the water, oblivious to this bear-like creature. If trees looked like shrubs, then the canoes and their occupants looked like rabbits riding on driftwood. The massive wolf or bear, whatever it was, swung one wide paw and sent one canoe flying where it evaporated against a tree. The people in it looked like rag dolls flying in the air. 3 more canoes came downstream. 2 of them visibly picked up speed as this thing wrecked one another. My blood ran cold as I saw this thing hold one of the persons down and end it with its jaws. It chased down the other remaining canoes, and it struck me. This thing wasn't feeding, it was killing, just for the sake of killing. Even after there was nobody left, it didn't bother taking the time for a meal. When I could think again, I tried to make a phone call ASAP and call 911, but I didn't have reception. It was too late to report anything by the time I had a few bars, although I didn't hesitate to call 911 and told them there had been some sort of massacre that I had witnessed. The operator seemed confused, but I told them exactly what I just told you. I was disturbed for the rest of the day, and for months afterwards. My family wondered if it was coming down with something. I wasn't sick, just completely shaken up over seeing exactly what sort of animals we share this world with. Now, I know the way I reported it to you might seem very fake, but I'm telling you, this is exactly what I saw, and I stand by it. I've never imagined seeing people torn to pieces, until this day. Turns out, I looked into it a little more shortly afterwards, and there was a report about several people being killed and eaten in a freak bear attack. I'm sorry, but that was not a bear. This stuff probably happens far more often than not. And I shall also include that when I was using the coin-operated binoculars, nobody else was up there with me. I just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And now, even though I'll probably be mocked and not believed by this story, it's important for me to get it out there, because I've been tired of keeping this on my chest, and I'm hoping that those who will listen to me will believe. This isn't written for the sake of scaring people. It's written to let people know that there are things out there we need to be careful of, and shouldn't just take the wilderness for granted like so many do. When I'm out for a bike ride, I've got a GoPro camera attached to my helmet and rolling, just in case. I've been out several times and got a chance to see some amazing sights of the wild. A cougar running in front of me. Sometimes even a bear with her mama cubs, but those are very rare occasions. The trail I like to take passes through some amazing scenery of pines and old oak forest that never quite look the same 2 rides in a row. It's like every time you go through, you're always mentioning and seeing a new detail, or seeing something that wasn't there before. Not that anything was changed, but again, everything's always different its second way through, and more. So I love capturing the scenery, and also any wildlife that I come across. Hence why I mentioned the cougar and the mama and her black bear cubs. Well, it finally happened. One of my rides brought me face to face with a bear. He was your average black bear that was fascinated by something meaty, moving so quickly. I learned that day that bears are much faster than they look. And by the way, this was a different time than the mama black bear and her small cubs. That was incredible too, by the way. But this black bear, I was actually having a difficult time staying ahead of him. I got to a point where the trail crested a hill and fell into a sharp drop. The extra speed brought me just enough time to ditch my bike and climb up an evergreen and hope that the bear would eventually lose interest. Or so I hoped. Bears are very determined animals. They'll spend a lot of time getting to something. After all, they're pretty headstrong. It must have been hungry because it wasn't losing interest anytime soon. It even did laps around the base of that tree, looking up at me, as if I had a huge piece of steak nailed to me. It stood up on its hind legs and pawed at the tree. Not aggressively, but definitely in determination and curiosity. I thought that I was toast, since I had seen bears climb trees before, albeit reluctantly. In fact, I nearly lost my grip on my branch when I saw the bear turn to look at an impossibly huge shape rocketing towards it. This oncoming animal looked like a bear for the most part, but the face and the ears and the eyes all said something like a wolf. Was I looking at a werewolf? Or was this something else? It was bizarre. In fact, the weirdest thing that caught my attention was that it was running on two legs, running just like an athletic runner. The black bear that had been chasing me was the size of a kitten in comparison to this hellhound. And when I say hellhound, I'm talking black fur, rippling muscles, but it had the odd shape of a bear, even resembling its round gargantuan body. It wasn't lean and slender, having a tapered off waist just like a dog does. It was round and full and thick, had short stubbier legs. It didn't have hocks like a dog would. It had large thick legs and front paws that were just full of muscle and meat. This larger animal opened wide with a mouthful of teeth, webbed with saliva, and nearly swallowed its prey whole, much like a snake. It was the most bizarre and chilling thing I had ever seen, that still is. Once this wolf bear took a huge chunk out of this black bear, it didn't bother dealing with me. It charged this smaller bear and swatted it with one gargantuan swipe of its paw. I heard the snapping of its vertebrae and joints and spine as the bear's trajectory was stopped by an old tree. This small black bear, or not small, but small in comparison to whatever the hell this thing was, let out howls of pain like I'd never heard before. Imagine a full-grown bear, male too, whimpering in pain like a puppy. This larger animal tore out pieces of its flesh, killing it. I was in shock. This whole thing has affected me far more than I could have thought. I couldn't form any complete sentences for the rest of the day. I must have been damn lucky, both to have seen that kind of living monster and to survived it. Naturally, I would send you the GoPro footage, but it didn't turn out clearly. It looked like crap. It had come loose and recorded from an awkward angle that didn't really reveal much, like such things always do in these stories, as if the natural world's darkest secrets make sure they stay secret. I know, you probably roll your eyes at me when I tell you this part of the story, but I'm telling you, this is how it happened. I was pissed, because I wanted to share this with the rest of the world. You damn well bet I was going to stick this up on YouTube and have everybody see the alpha predator of the forest that can clearly rip apart a black bear like nothing. Well, all I have is my story and the details that will accompany it. Again, I want to tell you that I've never seen an animal like this ever in my life, and I can't quite tell you or describe to you what exactly this was, other than it was larger than a grizzly bear, and I mean that with sincerity, since I have seen grizzly bears in the wild in Alaska before. Yes, they are massive, hulking animals, but this thing, Grizzly bears don't get to this size, and grizzly bears are not pitch black, nor do they have fur like this. I'm convinced now that perhaps what I was seeing was a hellhound, something out of the pits of hell. I love wolves. I'm not afraid of them the way that I should be. I get closer to them than anybody ever should. In fact, my friends even call me the Wolf Whisperer. I know that might sound cheesy, but it's just the title I've been given. I think Mother Nature must have detected that my gift with wolves was starting to go to my head, because I received what I thought was a polite warning to remind me that there is a clear boundary between the domain of man and the domain of animals. When I go camping, I make it a point to seek out wolves for photos. I usually have the right equipment to take pictures of the moon in the sky. So, when I spot a wolf perched on a cliff or an outcropping of rock at twilight, if I can get into the right position, the shot is magical. Any aspiring hobbyist photographer will know this, or professional ones. And then, I just enjoy the sounds of their howling. Well, let me get on to my encounter, because this will rock your life. This one particular night, I was surrounded by an especially beautiful orchestra of howling. I gave the camera a break and laid back in my tent to listen to the music. When these new strange voices were at the height of their howl, they were very smooth. They were also throaty and raspy when they trailed off. Well, my curiosity got the better of me, and I exited my tent to see if I could see anything. I could see a hill across a ravine. The full moon amplified the twilight. I must have timed my stepping out just perfectly, because I saw 4 enormous shapes crest that distant hill. These things were nothing less than a mammoth. I wondered if they were some rare species of gigantic bear. I got my answer when they sat on the grass and looked up at the moon and howled that eerie, low tone that made all the trees around me tremble. I could feel the sound waves in my chest, the vibrations, the timbre of their low growl. Well, it was more of a howl, but the howl had so much bass to it that it came off as a growl. It was so intense that I swear my heart stopped beating for several seconds at a time. The silhouettes were indeed bear-like, but there is something about the length and the slope of the pointed ears, the length of their coarse hair around the shoulders and the haunches, and those ragged long tails that suggested the presence of genetics belonging to something other than bears. This was easily the first time that I was truly terrified of anything related to wolves. I didn't bother staying the rest of the night, nor was there enough light that I can get an accurate picture of what I was seeing. Look, I know my camera, which is a D750, one of the best and some of the best cameras you can get, but even at the distance this was, I didn't have the right equipment to fully capture it. So, I got out of there quickly. Now to tell you, I have no idea what it is I was dealing with, nor what I was seeing. These weren't just your ordinary wolves, nor were these abnormally sized wolves. This was something else entirely. They didn't look exactly like wolves. They were something else, although they resembled wolves. I know, it probably sounds like I'm typing in circles, but I too am confused at what I saw. This, realistically, didn't make any sense of what I was seeing. So, because of that, I can only really think of one word, and that's to call them werewolves, because that's really the only thing that makes sense. Now, to add to the terror of what I have to tell you, I've had several other friends who have pursued similar situations out in the woods, have had similar stories to tell me, that they too have seen these same creatures, primarily in Montana and parts of Idaho, but all the way down to Colorado and Wyoming. So, I guess I'm not the only one, that these things are roaming around, and they do indeed exist. I guess I'm just discovering that for the first time.